Welcome to Fifth Quarter Bible. This is lesson 4 in our Return from Babylon series. This will be the intro video, jumping back into the book of Ezra, covering Ezra chapters 5 and 6, along with an overview of the book of Esther, which chronologically falls in between chapters 6 and 7 of the book of Ezra. So let's jump right into the lesson. As always, our overarching theme is the faithfulness and sovereignty of God in keeping his covenant promise to bring salvation to all the people groups of the world through the promised seed of Abraham and before him Eve. Again, God is a covenant-keeping God. He's sovereign in both judgment and restoration. He keeps his promises to his people, specifically his remnant. That has been the consistent theme throughout this series. The temple itself denotes the presence of God, and in this particular lesson the temple gets completed, and so we will now see the fulfillment of this temple being completed and what that means regarding the presence of God amongst the people, the primacy of the word of God, which has already been prevalent here but will especially become prevalent in our next lesson as we get into the second return led by Ezra, and finally the avoidance of idolatry. This is what got them into this mess to begin with, of being judged and exiled, and now through their leadership there's going to be an avoidance of such idolatry. So now, rather than go through all the main points that we covered in the book of Zechariah last week as we went over that book, Haggai and Zechariah being the two prophets that primarily prophesied to the people, and we'll be talking about both of them quite a bit in this lesson this week as well. I want you to take a quick peek if you missed any of them from last week. First, you can go back and watch that teaching video from lesson 3. It is linked in the description below. And if not, you can simply look here. You can see all the main points that we discussed as we did an overview of that book. I would again point you to, in particular, the final note here. The Lord powerfully intervenes on behalf of his people and in judgment over those who oppose him and his people. That would be a primary theme in the book of Zechariah. Also, the third point on the left of the screen, the message in Zechariah ultimately points to the new covenant where God's Spirit is poured out on and upon his people and in his people as well. Okay, so let's jump into what to look for this week as we get back into the narrative. Again, just to remind you, as we finished Ezra 4, going into Ezra 5, the rebuilding of the temple will begin under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Jeshua, the high priest, but inspired and really pushed forward by the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah. So what to look for in Ezra chapter 5? Number 1, the central role of Haggai and Zechariah. We already know quite a bit. We've read both those books now as part of this study, but see if you can pick up within the text itself in Ezra 5, what is the central role of Haggai and Zechariah? Why is the work on the temple prospering? So the work was prospering as they began. Why would it be prospering? What does the text say? The work is going to be challenged, but I do want you to notice the nature of this challenge as opposed to, say, the one that we read about earlier, but that comes later in the story when they're rebuilding the city and the walls and some of the other challenges that they faced early on from the early Samaritans. What seems to be the nature of this particular challenge as you read through Ezra 5? And then you'll see, what does this challenge result in? How does God use this challenge to the rebuilding of his temple by his people? How does God use this challenge, and how does it turn out? As we go into Ezra chapter 6, then, what to look for? Look for the Romans 8:28 connection. You should know what Romans 8:28 says, but if you don't, go read it and see if you can see a connection to that particular text within Ezra chapter 6. The realization of sin and the need for faith. See if you can see the people kind of realizing their sin and their need for faith. What is the significance of the Passover? That's going to get brought up in this text as well. So what significance did it play at that time? And what significance does it have in general? And who could participate in the Passover feast? Was it just Jews? Was it others? Who were they? How did one become able to participate in this feast at that time? Now, between Ezra 6 and 7, there's a long period of time, several decades, before the second wave of returnees come under Ezra. And so the book of Esther fits neatly between Ezra 6 and Ezra chapter 7. It does not occur back in Jerusalem at all, but it does occur in the Persian Empire, and it does involve God's covenant-keeping promises to his Jewish people. So some things to look for in this particular book as you read through it. It's not a short book, it's 10 chapters, so it's going to be a bit of a challenge to get through it this week, but I would encourage you to read the whole book if possible. But here's a brief intro, I should say, and some things to look for. Okay, this takes place between the time of the completion of the Second Temple in 515, which we just read about, or you would have just read about in Ezra 5 and 6, and the ministry of Ezra, which occurs in 457. You can see this sits neatly about 20 years before Ezra comes to Jerusalem. The author is unknown, although many scholars believe it's Mordecai, one of the main protagonists in the story. And the primary theme of the book is God's sovereign hand in keeping the Abrahamic covenant as part of redemptive history. This book is really about showing how God is a covenant-keeping God. I pray that you'll see that as you go through this. Now, some questions to ask yourself and what to look for as you read through the book of Esther. Who is the enemy of God's people in this story? And see if you can find the historical connection. Maybe you can right away, maybe you got to research it a bit, but see if you can find the historical connection in this particular story regarding the enemy of God's people here. There's appropriate obedience and disobedience that we see in this text and in this story. See if you can pick out the appropriate obedience, a little easier on that one, and the appropriate disobedience. When is it okay to disobey our rightful authority? And then finally, how and why does God deliver his people from this enemy? So how does he do it and why does he do it? And do you see it stated in the text, or is it implied strong enough in the text that we can make that conclusion? Okay, so that's what we want you to do this week. Read Ezra 5, 6, and the book of Esther, looking for these points. I pray you have a blessed week studying the Word, and we'll see you on the next one.